Oz for Payments with Christy. I'm Christy Duncan, and for those of you who don't know my guest, Victoria Richardson, she's here from Australia Payments Network, otherwise known as Oz PayNet, and she is Chief Strategy Officer. And I'm so excited to have you here with us today, Victoria. For those of you who don't know Victoria, she is one of, in my opinion, the world's thought leaders on digital ID and many things payments. So we're absolutely so lucky to have her here. Welcome, Victoria.
Oh, thank you very much, Christy. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join you in this. It's really exciting. It's really exciting to be talking about trust and how we prove who we are online in this time when many more people are doing many more things online. You know, it's that sort of perfect storm. Just in terms of what I know about digital identity, I really would like to acknowledge, you know, people talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, and there are many people much smarter than I am, many people that have a lot more technical knowledge about digital identity. I think what I've been lucky to experience is to being in an industry where someone had to take a lead and pull everyone together. And there's nothing quite like being told, you know, you've got to do this, that suddenly you find you have the ability to do it. And some of it comes from being with you. Much of it comes from drawing on the resources and the networks and connections that you had. And I think digital identity is unique in that it requires lots of different people. It requires a whole group of people to think about how it can work. So everything that I say is based on everything that everyone else has said, and I'm just in a lucky position to be able to pull it together.
Ah, so the ultimate collaborator. Good for you. You've got you've got such a great experience in your career, but I see that you're Chief Strategy Officer at Oz PayNet. How did you get to be working on digital ID? How did that come about?
Yeah, good question, Christy. So I think there are part of two parts to that. One, how did I? Then why did the payments industry? And I think why the payments industry is doing this is something that we've asked and answered throughout those sort of 4 years that we've been doing this. And we see that payments is at the front line of needing to build trust online. You know, the preference for digital commerce, the preference for digital onboarding is often in payments and financial services. Why me? When I joined the Australian Payments Network, I'd been doing some work for the Payments Council, which is a strategic body that Oz PayNet administers. And I've been doing some work for the Australian Payments Council on digital identity. Now, the reason the Payments Council was looking at it is they were thinking about their first payments plan. So back in 2015, the Australian payments industry, like many other sort of bodies, was saying, change is happening really quickly. How do we be preemptive? How do we work out where the future's going? And so there was this, a big consultation. And one of the things that came out from that consultation from industry was that as the future unfolds and becomes more digital, we need better mechanisms for building trust online. And in particular in Australia, the market recognised that there are 4 key characteristics of a desirable payment system. And those are resilience, efficiency, adaptability, and accessibility. And we said for the payment system to continue to have those key characteristics, we need better mechanisms of building trust online. And so it was from that payments plan where we said, okay, as an industry, what do we need to focus on? And digital identity was one of those core projects. So that's why me, and that's why the Australian Payments Network.
Wow, fabulous. So there's a real tie-in to the payments piece as well, and probably a little bit to the consumer data right, ultimately, that's rolling out across Australia at this time also. But in terms of where we take digital ID, you've got some great projects on the go, and you're putting in some some very important frameworks for the industry to work with. Where do you see the big opportunities or perhaps use cases in the Australian market?
So I think if we think about, you've mentioned the consumer data right, it's a huge opportunity in the Australian market. So a number of jurisdictions are looking at how do you enable the data economy. And it's called different things in different countries. You know, I think everyone's familiar with the Payment Services Directive in Europe, the UK flavour of that, which is open banking. In Australia, I think the government and advisors took a step back and were in quite an enviable position of being a fast follower, but not having to follow exactly what everyone else had done. And so the approach in this market is to think about open data across the whole of the economy, and open banking is the first cab off the rank, if you like. So if you have an open data economy, the intention is to create more choice for consumers, deliver better consumer outcomes, and to sort of create competition in products and services. So an evolved open data economy might mean that as an individual, Christy, say you wanted to change your energy provider or you wanted to change your mortgage, you know, there's some data that the energy provider has about you that could be shared under a consumer data right. But there are other pieces of information that other organizations have about you that you might also want to share in that transaction. And a digital identity framework, a trust framework, can provide a mechanism for the sort of safe, secure, and liability held sharing of that information. And so I think that's where we see an open data economy. We need robust mechanisms for managing the security of the data and managing the liability of transactions.
Wow, so this is putting into place a whole new infrastructure to enable and further a digital economy based on trust that we may not have had before.
I think that's right. And, you know, payments is predicated on trust. You know, in payments, when you go online to pay someone, you trust that the right amount will arrive with the intended recipient at the right time. And the payments industry has multiple competing frameworks. Every single country has card schemes. Many of them, like in Canada, you've got a national debit scheme. There are international card schemes. There are faster payment rails using ISO 20022. There are the existing direct debit frameworks. And they're a really good sort of framework, a blueprint for thinking about how identity could support an open data economy as well.
Fantastic. So I want to talk a little bit about use cases, but you've been working on one in particular, I think, that's just been being tested and launched in the Australian market that sounds really compelling and really interesting. Can you share a little bit about that?
I think what we've done in the Australian market is create a framework that will allow multiple competing service providers. So as the sort of coordinating body that manages the collaboration, we haven't focused on a use case per se. What we've done is enable a framework to support multiple competing service providers that deliver use cases. So an example might be that if you wanted to buy an age-restricted product online, you could go online and you could have your identity service provider say, yes, Christy is over the age of 18. They don't need to know your date of birth. They might not need to know anything else other than you're over the age of 18. So when we created the framework, we tried to have use cases in mind, and we tried to create a framework that would build privacy around those different use cases, and proof of age is just one illustration of that. But we feel it's really important for the market to come up with the use cases. And, you know, there are a number that have been discussed. You know, if you talk to the retailers, proof of age is a significant problem for them. I think in some of the online gambling, you know, there's a move in Australia at the moment to understand whether credit cards should be banned for use in online gambling. You know, in a face-to-face environment, you can't withdraw money from your credit card to gamble, but you can online. And the reason you can online is that credit cards are used as a proxy for proof of age. So there are parts of the industry thinking, oh, well, how could we have privacy respecting mechanisms to do proof of age that means that we're not using the payment instrument for that? So yeah, in summary, I think where our focus has been to anticipate some of the use cases and to put a framework in place that allows the creative companies that are closer to the customers to come up with the really exciting use cases.
So interesting. And when I look back at, for example, our Canadian experience, we're not as far ahead as you in developing out this framework, but very often I get asked for my driver's license to prove my age when people don't need to know that I'm permitted to drive. They only need to know that I have attained a certain age. So it's really interesting. We've worked in the past with these paper ID credentials that may or may not even have been relevant in a given situation.
Yeah, I think driver's licenses are a really good example of how unwittingly you give too much information away at the point that you're using it. And yeah, it's intended as a permission to drive, not a proof of your identity. In Australia, there's a movement in all the different states, much like the US. You know, Australia has different states and they have their own jurisdictional powers, and driver's licenses are issued on a state basis rather than by the federal government. And so the different states are digitizing their driver's licenses. And the intention is that those will be used online. It's an open question as to whether they'll be used as an identity document online. So, you know, I guess the intention should be that you will have other mechanisms of proving your age online. And I think the reason it's important is that it's hard to imagine how the issuers of driver's license will carry liability for when you're not over 18. And the whole point of an identity framework, you know, we focus on the technology, but really the management of the liability is key to a successful digital identity framework. And it's why some of the, why driver's licenses and passports break down. If you haven't got a liability structure around those assertions and around the credentials, then it just won't work, and people won't use them because there will be no benefit to using them.
Right, and clearly they're open to fraud, especially if they're paper documents, and there's a lot of fraud going on. But I imagine also, I've been thinking a lot about this lately as we progress in this whole global pandemic situation, and people keep talking about, well, after we get the vaccine, then things will get better. But then we're talking about things like health credentials. And personally, I think those health credentials will somehow need to be attached to our identity. And it seems to be a golden opportunity to tie the two together to make them irrefutable, immutable. Have you thought about that at all in Australia?
Yeah, I don't think it's something that certainly not publicly, the Australian government's talking about, but I have heard this discussion about this in the UK about if the intention is to create a society of people that are immune to something, then when you have immunity, you need to be able to prove that. And much like any other attribute about you, it's a piece of information that you want to be able to assert, and you want to, there needs to be some legitimacy around that assertion. There needs to be some authority. And I think it's not difficult to imagine that conceivably I could have a digital certificate that's issued to my payment wallet on my phone, or is issued to my health card, that allows me to prove that I have immunity to a certain disease. I think there are a lot of privacy concerns around that, and I think we haven't solved all those questions yet. And I think that it's something that will be very different depending on which country you're in as well. And one of the things that we really know about digital identity is that it's culturally specific. So when people talk about how do we make this work on a global basis, you know, it's one thing to solve this on a country level. How do you solve it across borders? I think one of the things to think about is there are things that can solve technical interoperability. And we do that very well in payments. You know, you can have global standards bodies, you can have accreditation and certification. It's one thing to do it on the technical level. It's an entirely different thing to do it at a cultural level. And, you know, with payments, we see global standards for interoperability. And then nationally, there are always some sort of local operational security requirements and some configurations. And I think in identity, those local configurations will be shaped around what's culturally acceptable around identity. And there is a vast difference, you know, when you look at India or the Nordics or the UK or Canada and Australia, there's a huge difference between what people will allow their government to do and what they will allow private organizations to do. And even within countries there are difference. You know, I don't use social logins. I don't have a Facebook account because I understand there's a trade-off. You know, it's free, but they get my data, and I've chosen not to be part of that. But I completely get the convenience aspect of it. So yeah, to recap, I think that, you know, we need to understand that these digital identity and building trust is culturally specific, and that's probably one of the hardest things to resolve on a global level. You know, what are the equivalences?
Yes, so those are really good points, Victoria. I understand now that the interoperability from a technical perspective is perhaps secondary to interoperability from a cultural perspective. And we see that even just culturally, differences in how different countries are approaching, again, this COVID-19 pandemic, and they're handling it all very differently. And the different cultures come with different outcomes. So very interesting. And also what they're allowing, what cultures will allow their governments to do. You know, I see Asian cultures will allow their governments to do very different things from perhaps a Western culture.
Although without wanting to dive into the politics of that, I don't know if surprised is the right word, but it's interesting to me that for nations that hold their freedom, you know, really close to their heart, that think that freedom and liberty is really important, it's really interesting how we've allowed ourselves to have very much less freedom, how very quickly we've accepted the need to stay home and be shaped by a lot of the fear language that has come with how a government creates a response at a national level to a pandemic. So I think it's quite interesting that under some circumstances, probably all of us react in a different way because of the orders of magnitude of the threat. So you know, it isn't the case that in Australia at the moment, I don't need a digital identity to do things online. It would make it a lot more convenient, but I don't need my bank to issue me with a credential that allows me to do certain things other than online banking. It will be interesting to see what happens if we're in a situation where I need that to be able to go into a supermarket, or I need that to be able to go into an office building. We're not there yet, and there was some debate recently here about, we have this COVID-19 app, and there were some questions about whether a retailer could require someone to show that they had it installed on the phone before they went into the store. And there was a big pushback, as I would imagine from Australian citizens. I would imagine that being a requirement for entry into a store. However, we do, we're quite comfortable with the requirement of proof of age to go into a nightclub. It's a long time since I've been in a nightclub, but we're comfortable with that. So I think it's just how that evolves is probably a lot about the needs that we have in a given situation, and what we find acceptable, and that the pain threshold, what we're prepared to do to get to what's on the other side. And I imagine that will change. If I really wanted into the supermarket, maybe I'll be prepared to show them my app.
Yes, well, we're entering a whole new era of health credentials and what we are willing to sacrifice, but also to accept in terms of our own personal freedoms for the greater health of the population, both domestically and globally. So it's going to be very interesting to watch it all evolve. Clearly, it's a whole new market when it comes to digital ID, getting back to the ID piece of this. Victoria, can you share what you might see as big opportunities when it comes to digital ID?
Yeah, I think there are, if we think about the marketplace for authentication and identification and information sharing services, I think the opportunity is sort of specific to where you sit in that marketplace. So if I'm a retailer, the ability for someone to come to my online site, to log in using an existing credential, and bypassing all of the painful sign-up processes, to pay very simply, that's huge. So that, and the benefit to me is that, that the customer convenience translates into fewer cart abandonments, a better customer relationship, better personalization, and also from the retailer perspective, probably less card fraud as well. So from a retailer, if just thinking about that customer element, it's more convenient and it's more secure, and that's going to improve my bottom line. And so I think that's where that huge opportunity is. Digital identity is an enabler. It's an enabler of convenience and security, and that's really clear that that's a benefit for retailers. I think for governments, there's a big push to online service delivery. And it's not just because governments want to reduce the cost of online service delivery. It's also because it's more efficient, and there is a consumer pull for online service delivery. I'm moving in 2 days' time, and everything has been done online, apart from the physical removal of boxes. And I'm hugely grateful for that. DocuSign. So I think that from the government's perspective, it's governments meeting citizens' needs. There is this pull for online service delivery, but there's also that efficiency gain where overall the total cost of service delivery should go down. And I think that was one of the clear things that came out of the work in Canada, where the Canadian government partnered with banks, and the intention was for them to sort of outsource, if you like, the cost of online authentication. It's a great model. So I think from governments, there are some clear benefits. I think for financial service providers, it's quite an interesting conversation, and it's a conversation that we've been having in Australia under the Payments Council for a number of years. And there are a number of drivers. There's the opportunity to reduce compliance costs. It is the case at the moment that if I've got a relationship with Bank A, and then I want a relationship with Bank B, as many consumers in Australia do, many of us are multi-banked, you'd have thought that I'd be able to say to Bank B, oh, I've been with Bank A for 20 years, can you just check with them and then onboard me? And that's not the case. We're all aware of the requirements for know your customer, and so, but those create duplicative costs. I think the last count, there was a report that was done that said that those costs, duplicative costs every year, are $43 million. So from the bank's perspective, there's an opportunity to lower compliance costs for digital onboarding. I think from a banking perspective, there are a lot of opportunities for the bank to be more present in transactions online with my permission, but there's an opportunity for the banks to help me log into my telco, log into my energy provider. You know, I'd really like a secure place online where I could store all of my data and my passwords and my documents. And personally, I trust my bank with that. They're heavily regulated. And when the banks do something that society isn't so happy with, the government comes in and sorts them out. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for the banks to play a bigger role in our digital lives. They look after our money. You know, if people didn't trust banks, we'd all be using Bitcoin for everything, or another currency. And that's not the case. So I think there is an opportunity for banks to extend their trusted relationship into other areas of my life. I do know that view isn't held by everyone. And I think, you know, to think about someone else who's in the trust equation of digital identity, telecommunications providers, they're also in a trusted position. Perhaps they could extend out their services. So I think from a bank's perspective, to go back to the question about, you know, what are the opportunities? There's a huge burden of compliance. There's an opportunity to reduce that burden of compliance and create efficiencies. And there's also an opportunity to be more present in my digital life and add value. And I think that, you know, there are some really good examples where banks are focused in on that. And I think the final person in that equation is an individual. And I sort of touched on some of the benefits that I see there already. But I do, as an individual, I would love a way to log in online across multiple sites where there wasn't this sort of hidden trade-off between privacy and data, where I'm paying for services with my data. It's just the trade-off isn't made explicit. I'd love for my bank to offer me that service. And I also want an easy way of organizing everything online. You know, I've got various cloud-based documents. I'd like them in probably a more secure cloud. You know, I'd like someone to offer me a filing cabinet online, and I think that the banks are really looking at services that they can offer to their customers. But I want privacy and security and convenience, and I'm led to believe I can have it all, maybe just not yet.
Well, I love that, Victoria. Thank you for that. That's very insightful. I really like your concept of banks being custodians, trusted custodians, not only of our financial assets, but perhaps other data assets or passwords or other information that we want a nice, secure, trusted place to keep it. And that's potentially a new market for banks. I know we're talking about open banking where, you know, people have been worried that the banks will become irrelevant. And I actually think that's not going to be the case, because the banks, as you say, they hold trusted relationships with virtually all the people in our populations, at least all the banked ones. And there is a huge amount of trust there, so much so that, as in Canada, as you say, the banks are performing an authentication service on behalf of our federal government, which is, you know, a huge testament to how much we trust our banks. I know we're good at bank bashing as a population, but we don't necessarily love our banks, but we do trust them, which is a good thing. Well, these are really great insights, Victoria. Thank you so much for sharing. Victoria, these are amazing insights. Thank you so much for sharing. To close our discussion, I want to talk a little bit to our audience, because we have this amazing audience of women around the world working in the payments industry. And I wonder if you might be able to share some of your career pearls of wisdom with us.
Sure, Christy. I think one thing I'm aware of when I look back in my career is at each stage in each job, or at university, or the first job after university, or my job before this one, it was that picking one thing and doing it really well. And often when I went into the role, I wasn't certain what it was going to be. But then when I got settled in and I worked out, what can I bring to this? What do I know? What do I want to know? What am I motivated by? What are the people around me doing? And I think I picked things that I was passionate about, that where I knew I could make a difference, and when I could see people around me who could support me. And I think those things are really important. We spend a lot of time at work, and I think picking something you're passionate about, picking something you're good at, or can get good at, and picking things that, well, you've got some support around you. And over the years, I studied Russian at university for years. That was my passion. And it led me onto technology. And technology led me into smart cards. And smart cards led me into consulting, that led me into digital identity, that led me here. And I think all of my colleagues, when you look back, you think, oh, that makes perfect sense. And it doesn't when you're going through it. But if you pick something as a thread and build on it, it can be your platform for the next thing. So, yeah.
That's a great career story. Thank you for sharing that, Victoria. Well, this has been an absolutely really insightful discussion. I love hearing your thoughts and the direction on digital ID and what's happening in the Australian market. This is a really important framework that you're putting together, and I love how it spans not only the payments industry and financial services, but through the consumer data right extends on into telecom and utility industries as well. I love this enabling the data economy and how digital ID can be a key to really kind of facilitating all of this, so it becomes that much faster, easier, more secure, more trusted for consumers to be able to enjoy services at multiple levels. The security, of course, is a huge benefit that I think we'll all appreciate, having hopefully fewer of those fraud instances that impact all of us one way or another. And I personally will look forward to more government services being delivered online. And don't mail me anything that's snail mail. Sorry to Canada Post or Australia Post, but it's not my preferred communication mode. And if I can get away from it in any way, I will absolutely encourage that. So thank you for sharing. It's wonderful.
Pleasure. But really, thank you for asking me on. I was just going to say, I think the post office is reinventing itself. So if you think, I know in Australia at the moment, there's a delay in parcel delivery. So we're not going into stores, we're ordering parcels online. So I think that the post service globally will stop delivering letters, and they'll deliver things. They'll deliver groceries. So I don't think they're dying. I think, the sooner we stop making them focus on letters and create demand for more expensive packages, that probably works out for them too.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Victoria. This has been really insightful. Thanks very much. And for everybody else today, thanks, Victoria. I encourage our audience to join us online for many other Pause for Payments episodes that we have planned coming up weekly. And we've got a whole lineup of inspirational international women from around the world in our industry who will share some fantastic insights. So thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you again, Victoria.
Thank you.